Hey, IT friends, how's it going? Happy Tuesday. Lily and I are here today. We want to talk a little bit about the difference between after hours and emergencies, specifically at the MSP level. I think sometimes we blend the two in sort of common vernacular, which is fine, but I don't know that we always remember to separate the two when we're thinking about the business aspect of things. And Lily has thoughts on that. I think the first thing you really need to establish is there a difference between after hours work and emergency work? And some of you immediately are going to say, yeah, of course there is. And I would agree with you. But you need to come to that realization at your MSP or MSSP or whatever your support organization is on your own. And I think one of the easiest ways to arrive at that determination is to think about anything that comes in outside of your regularly defined help desk hours. Let's say that's 8 to 5. And anything outside of those hours, who is it urgent for? And what you're going to find in most cases, even with emergencies, is that it's urgent for the client, not for you. You're going to embody a sense of urgency in your response, but it's not actually your emergency. And a great example of this is if you're the fire department and your client's building is on fire, who's going to lose everything? It's not you, it's them. Their building's going to burn down. All their stuff's going to burn up. There's going to be property damage, insurance claims, loss of business continuity. That's all an emergency the next morning for the client, not for the fire department. The fire department's going to respond with a sense of urgency and do the very best they can to put that fire out as quickly as possible. But none of the firemen or the fire department are going to have to be on the phone with an insurance adjuster the next morning. And so it's important to think about all that stuff that happens outside of your normal help desk hours. Who is it urgent for? And if the answer is for the client, then, well, they got to pay, right? They got to pay for that. And I think that's a little bit easier to then come in and make that distinction between after hours work and emergency work. So if we put a pin in that for a second, so that leaves us with a certain amount of after hours work that we're not volunteering to do on our own because it benefits us. We'll talk about that in a minute. That the client wants done after hours. And this could be anything from regular reactive work because they're working a little bit late on, a Tuesday, to project work where they don't want their business interrupted during the daytime. Now, I was a big proponent at my MSP that when we're closed, we're closed. So if our normal support is from 8 to 5 and you agreed to that when you signed up to work with us, and now you want work done outside of those hours, I don't staff outside of those hours. So it's not a matter of whether or not I can get you to pay. I don't pay anybody to be responsible to me at that time period. So it sucks to be you. The restaurant's closed. The chef isn't here right now. I'm not saying that mindset is a good fit for everybody or is even the right way to approach it. That was just how I approached it. But I do think it's important that you got to think about now, if you're being asked to do work after hours that isn't an emergency, why? And it goes back to that question, who is it important to? If the client is saying, I don't want that project being done at 2 o'clock on a Thursday because we're open, okay, well, then why did you agree to our normal hours of support to begin with if you knew that maintenance work that requires downtime that hopefully I presented to you wasn't acceptable to be performed during business hours? You need to pull on that thread a little bit. And the reason why I'm going with all of this is ultimately whether you choose to do any sort of non-emergency work after hours or not, the client needs to be financially responsible for it, because that is once again a part of the risk pie that you guys never really talked about, and now you're expected to eat the entire risk pie. And that's not really a situation you want to be in for a whole variety of reasons that we could probably cover in another video. So what about those of you that are doing things after your normal hours because they're easier for you? This tends to be more like proactive maintenance tasks, things like that. So I guess my first advice would be cut that out. Stop that. Because you're lying to yourself. Because you're just robbing the agreement, and you're gonna eventually burn your staff out. If you're the only staff member, you're gonna burn yourself out. But at a more business level version of that conversation, that's billable time that's being done outside the scope of the agreement. Why is it being done outside the scope of the agreement? And I generally find, and this kind of dovetails into my next point, I generally find it's because most people, most business owners start to feel fundamentally guilty about charging appropriately for services being rendered. It's a form of selling out of your own pocket. And there's this sense that, well, I made this decision, not the client, therefore I can't hold the client responsible for it. And at a very, very superficial level, yeah, I get that. That makes sense. I think that's a reasonable statement. But when you drill into it, you did it in service of the client as their IT administrator. So it really is for the client, not for you, because you wouldn't be doing any maintenance at that time if you didn't have that client. And so I think that's important to assess, and once again, not do for free. And I get some of you are going to say, well, I ding it against my agreement, or I ding it against the block, or whatever. No, I mean, in other words, that you do have some sort of after hours multiplier on that. And I want that to be uncomfortable. I want you to feel uncomfortable charging, whatever, 1.5x for checking backups at 6 p.m. on a Friday, because it's easier for you to do then. Because I want you to think critically about the fact that, why am I not doing this during the daytime when the client paid me to do it? Because that's an important thing you need to have a conversation about with yourself, not with the client. Because we do this a lot to ourselves in the service industry, where we will take on work that we are contractually obligated to do in the spirit of the contract, but we'll take it on outside the contract without appropriately setting those expectations ever. And the challenge is, eventually over time, your clients will become aware you do this work after hours, and it will become an expectation. And that's problematic. And we see this all the time. It helped when you get to a point where you want to start doing after hours work more efficiently, like more officially, and now you want to charge for it. It's much harder to overcome that barrier now if you've basically been doing it for free for the last few years, whether you told the client about it or not. They have an idea. So you really don't want to put yourself in that position where you're selling out of your own pocket and giving away after hours work. And if genuinely the only way you can get it done is to do it after hours, then you're stretched too thin, and you're oversold. Something else is going wrong during the daytime. You don't have enough staff, you're wildly inefficient, something isn't right. It's not normal for you to have to do free work that's not accounted for or planned in the contract after your business hours at no additional cost to the client, in spirit of just keeping the client running. The interesting thing is, most people are willing to consistently spend small amounts of money to abate pain until they're not. And I've given this example in previous videos of the dog on the nail, but if you think of it in terms of emergency and after hours support, you need to push the decision on if that dog's going to climb off that nail, if that client is going to continue requesting services outside the scope of your agreement, back to them. And the easiest way to do that, the easiest way to make that nail as painful as possible, is simply to charge for it consistently. Don't back down on it. Don't charge for it most of the time, but sometimes don't. Just consistently charge for it, and allow the client to either say, you know what, I am totally fine with this. Like, I don't mind paying this person 2.5 their normal rates to call an emergency on a Saturday. I appreciate having them there. Alternatively, eventually the client may get sick and tired of that and may approach you and say, hey, I have these support challenges when you're closed, and they don't like having to pay extra for them. And you guys can have a whole conversation about ways to abate that. It could be hiring an outsourcing provider, like Helped or someone else to cover and now make that a regular part of your support agreement. Or it could be they stop calling for it. It could be that you go in and finally make that upgrade to their environment that would reduce the need for them to call in with that emergency. Who knows? But the point is, it's not all just your risk to eat up as the MSP and just be quiet about and silent about on the sidelines. Oh, and a final thought, whatever you set up, please make sure that it's reflected properly in your PSA for time capture and billing. Nearly every PSA has some method of coding time based on either who's performing the work or what kind of work they're performing. And whether you do that with a multiplier or a dollar rate, whatever kung fu you use in your PSA, make sure that your after hours time has a separate way to be recorded, and that method that it's recorded is for a higher amount than your normal time. Make sure your team clearly and actionably understands how and when to enter it, and make sure that it flows through to your chart of accounts properly. I say all of this because when you eventually do decide that you really do want to start treating all of your agreements a little bit more mature, you want to go after the efficiency of them a little bit more. Whenever someday you decide you want to stop these, to be clear, all of the things we've talked about in this video are very low maturity behaviors. Doesn't mean bad, just they're low maturity behaviors. If you get to a point where you want to move above that, you're going to be very thankful that you've been accurately cataloging and tracking it this entire time, because it's going to give you very actionable data on exactly what the costs have been, the frequency, who needs it the most, etc., etc. If you haven't been tracking it, you'll be starting at zero, you'll be guessing, and that's not a comfortable place to be in, especially once you've decided you want to make change. So just make sure you're tracking it appropriately now in your PSA. There's tons of great resources out there that can explain this, but most PSAs will have, in whatever their knowledge base is, some sort of information on how to set this up. Just don't neglect that. Don't leave that piece for future you. Go fix that now. Even if there is no additional bill currently, make sure it's still captured and tracked appropriately. Don't throw it all in the same dumpster as everything else. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. Start valuing your time.